Are you an early stage founder revolutionizing the future of retail? Then you're in the right place. My name is Shah, and I'm an angel investor investing at the pre-seed stage in retail tech, e-commerce, and digitally native brands. I'm also the founder of Retail X Series, an in-real-life event series based in New York to help early-stage founders think through topics like customer acquisition, sales pipelines, branding, financial modeling, fundraising, and more. In this podcast, I interview founders and investors who've spoken at Retail X Series events in the past, and we dig deep into the tactics around key topics that early-stage founders want to hear about. Welcome to the Retail X podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Retail X Series podcast. I'm your host, Sevin, and today's episode is all about getting those early B2B pilots and contracts. Our guest today, Leigh Sevin, co-founder of Endear, will share her perspective on how she closed her early pilots and contracts. Welcome to the podcast, Leigh.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with some background. Tell us a little bit more about your company, your background, and kind of where you stand right now in terms of, just overall number of clients and kind of where you've gotten to from a traction perspective.
Sure. So my co-founder and I met about 4 or so years ago through the Venture for America Fellowship. But Endear as an idea really didn't come about until about 2 years ago. We had actually started a different company before that. And so now over those 2 years, we first ran a beta for about a year. So from March of last year until March of 2018 to March of 2019. And then in March of 2019, the big turning point for us was that we launched publicly as a Shopify app. So now we work with about 40 or so different brands and retailers, primarily Shopify merchants, primarily as you know, small and medium-sized brick and mortar stores. And within that, we really range everything from luxury apparel to home goods to leather and accessories. It really runs the gamut. But the most important thing for us is that we're helping brick and mortar stores better stay in touch with their local customers.
And can you tell us a little bit more about what your product does that helps those brick and mortar stores stay in touch with their customers?
Yeah, so the big problem for physical retail right now is that because of how shoppers have moved a lot of their activity online, stores are typically vacant for about 40% of their operating hours, which means that when a retailer spends money on a sales associate, they're really only getting a return on 60% of those hours. So what Endear does is it gives those associates the ability to dedicate those periods of low traffic to outbound marketing by emailing and texting with shoppers that have actually shopped with them previously. And they can do that either by sending a one-off text message to check on a recent purchase or send even a mass invite to a certain segment of their local audience over email.
Great, thank you. So that was a great summary of kind of where you are now and what you're doing. But let's go back to the early days. So you target, as you said, small, medium-sized businesses. They're not huge enterprise brands and clients. So at that earliest stage of your company, before you had any customers, how did you make those decisions to target those small and medium-sized companies? Who was that first customer that you thought would be sort of your ideal customer, and how did you go after them?
What really happened was that when we first did our investigation into this space, we had an opportunity and we made it sort of a priority to speak to retailers across the board in terms of size. And over again, what we heard was that on the enterprise side, a lot of those big box retailers or department stores who, as you said, we don't really target, we're always building custom solutions because of all the different systems they already had running. And so that was the only way they could do this. But when we spoke to the SMBs, sort of more in the 10 to 40 location range, the big takeaway was that those associates were still completely dependent on analog pen and paper or using Google Sheets. And so we realized that was really the white space in the market, that no one had built a self-service version of those custom solutions. And we really wanted to fill that space.
And who at that point did you think the ideal customer was, or the ideal brand to start launching with?
So we weren't very picky, which can happen a lot when you're early and you're just begging people to try your product. So fortunately for us, because of a previous iteration, we did already have a number of connections with up and coming digital brands that were opening their first stores. So those were actually a lot of our first customers because they were really open-minded. They knew that they wanted their online and offline basically operations to be seamlessly connected. And so when we saw that they were opening stores, that was actually the biggest reason we didn't even believe in the retail apocalypse, because we had these early customers who were really excited about brick and mortar. So we went after those first, but to be honest, the funny thing was, while we pursued them as early customers, our first early customer completely came by chance, having run into a family friend at LaFleur, who actually was our first customer.
So how did that LaFleur relationship kind of develop, and how did you structure your kind of first deal with them?
So I was thinking about this just yesterday because I was wondering how we actually managed to pull this off. And the big thing that came to mind was that we had the advantage that we actually had one part of our product already built for a slightly different situation. And it was actually perfectly aligned with what needed at the time. And so we were able to sell this one, which is now basically only a quarter of Endear's total functionality, because it really satisfied a very specific need. And the nice thing for us was that we were continuing to run a revenue generating separate product in the background. So money, while it was still a concern, was not getting in the way by any means.
And so does that mean that you kind of ran this product for them, or this one segment of your product for them, as a kind of a free pilot?
Yeah, so what we did was we agreed that we would do 3 months of a free pilot. And at that point, we'd renegotiate on a price based on performance. So the cool thing about doing a free pilot was that there was no opportunity for loss. They weren't paying us up front. And it really meant that they were taking the time to actually help us build the product in the right way. And that was also really what we pitched them from the get-go was, listen, by being an early customer, you're going to have a ton of say into how we construct this. We really want your feedback. We actually met with them every 2 weeks during the free pilot to get their feedback and understand what features we should add and what part of the experience was best and what wasn't so great. So after those 3 months, we came back and said, can you tell us a little bit about how this impacted your numbers, your customer satisfaction, your employee satisfaction, and built a price based on that.
And so a lot of times, entrepreneurs find that when they do a free pilot and they give their product or some version of their product for free, it is really hard to get the brand to then pay, because they're either A, used to getting it for free, or B, they don't value it as much because it was free. How did you counteract that with your first customer?
Actually, as an advisor of ours always says this to us. He says, if you take it away and they don't pull their hair out, you haven't found product market fit. So that was really the big thing for us was, the product did so much for them that I think even the idea of going back to how they did things before was so unfathomable that we both knew, given that they were our first customer, we were going to walk away with some amount of money that wasn't zero. And that was good for them because they got to keep the product, and that was good for us because it proved that there was value.
Got it. So it was really just that the product became so entrenched really relatively quickly, within 3 months.
Yes, and the other thing is we really set the ground rules for this will become a paid product. We're doing a free pilot. If you don't want to pay at the end, that is a huge lesson for us. But if you do, then it's really just about negotiation. And even during the free pilot, we put in metrics and KPIs to better understand what the monetary value of the platform was to them so that we could make those later conversations a little bit easier.
That makes sense. So let's get into that part about the paid side of things. So when you thought about pricing, and I think pricing is a topic that kind of B2B companies think about all the time, how did you originally kind of charge? What pricing models did you consider using? Tell us kind of your thought process on how pricing has come about.
Sure. So with our beta, honestly, because we knew our beta customers so well, we very much proposed a price that we thought that specific brand would be willing to pay based on their size. And what we were doing is we were basically putting out different gut checks to understand beyond what we would use to get to that price, what was the actual number that would make them flinch or that would make them say yes too quickly. And once we got that number from, say, a dozen or so brands, then we backed into what the different levers could be to actually yield that typical price. So once we did the beta, we actually moved into a data-based charging system and pricing system. And that was because that was our major cost. The fact that we were storing so much data and giving users the ability to filter, sort, manipulate was actually a huge cost to us. And so we wanted to make sure that we were always basically hedging our bets with that. The problem was that it made no sense to anybody. And it also meant that the price was super volatile and everyone basically felt like they had no idea what their cost was going to be at the end of the month, which is really not what you want with a subscription service.
Right. And how did you, when you first had that data model, how did you explain it to them?
The shorthand was, we're going to charge you based on the number of customers you're storing in our system. That seems pretty straightforward because that's sort of how MailChimp charges, right? Like how many contacts are you going to keep in your database? The problem was that there were also a lot of other variables, such as how many products you were storing, how rich those sort of customer data profiles were. And then the biggest problem was that, as I said from the beginning, we're a brick and mortar platform. So these actually very large digital brands were saying, but you don't actually do anything with about 80% of my customer base. Why am I paying you for that data, to store that data? And so we realized very quickly that it was not a sustainable model. And we moved to what we do now, which is actually a per seat model. You pay for the number of associates that you want using Endear.
And that is much more clear to your customers, is my guess.
Much, much more clear, very standard, per seat. And even now, though, as you said, we're always thinking about ways to make it simpler, better understand. I think the biggest takeaway has been that we spend more time looking at how our customers use the platform and what structures they always say back to us when we tell them how pricing works, and then move to actually replicate and follow that way of explaining things.
Right. And then did you ever try a rev share model? Because I know that's something that a lot of early stage companies do try in the beginning to make it more palatable for the brand.
We always thought about a rev share model, but the big response from retailers was, we don't want you eating into our top line. We want to know that the money we owe, that we make, is ours. We want to also know that we're paying a consistent price for this. And so rev share was never really on the table, at least because of the early discussions we had with customers. It was not something that they were comfortable with. And we also loved that it meant our MRR, our monthly recurring revenue, was going to be more consistent.
Right, that makes sense. It sounds like the common theme here is that what was hard for the brands was having no transparency into volatility of pricing, and the per seat pricing really took that uncertainty out of the picture.
Yes, for sure. And, the cool thing about the way we charge now, especially with the types of brands that we work with, is right now it's $50 per user. $50 for most of our brands is less than the price of a single product. So all they're really, basically the bet that they're making is that by inviting that one user onto Endear, they're going to at least sell one more additional product that month, which seems like a pretty safe bet.
It's a little bit of a no-brainer.
We think so.
Well, thank you for that sort of deep dive on pricing, because I know that it's just a huge question that comes up over and over again with entrepreneurs that I speak about. So let's pivot a little bit to talking about sales cycle. So, you hear all the time kind of in the world that that enterprise customers are always the worst, and, sales cycles can last like 24 months or even longer. How has the sales cycle been for working with the size of companies that you're working with, small and medium sized businesses?
Our sales cycle is somewhere in between what a typical SaaS software sees now when they're just what I would call sort of a single user platform, and what you see with enterprise. Because at the end of the day, a typical account for us is still going to have multiple users, a dozen, if not up to, say, 40 or 50 users. So there is still the fact that you're dealing with a larger team. But our sales cycle, because you can start with literally just one store, is never more than a month to actually sell. And then most of our merchants, most of our customers do get a 30-day free trial that we work with them very closely during to make sure that things go smoothly. For us, we're like, oh my God, this took 6 weeks. That's way too long. And people in enterprise are like, that's how long it took me to write the contract for the deal. So that part's really nice.
What do you look for? Who do you speak to at each of these customers that you are selling to? Is there a particular title? Is there a particular person? Is there a particular department that you know is the right entry point into that company?
The big lesson actually from the past 6 months has been better understanding what the key qualifiers are for our leads. And a big one within that group is the fact that the brand needs to have a proper retail team and a proper retail director. If they do not have that, and we're speaking to, if they're small and we're speaking to the founder, that's great. But that also usually means that they don't really have their retail legs under them quite yet. And so we really want to make sure that retail is a priority, that they have someone whose job is on the line to make the retail stores successful and run properly. And so that's really the key for us, is that person and that role exists within the company. And that's who we target for sales.
That makes a ton of sense. There are definitely other sorts of companies and other founders that I've talked to where the title or the department can change from client to client. And so, because many brands are set up differently, or people have different titles, or they have different sets of responsibilities, have you found that it's relatively consistent to sort of have somebody who is in charge of retail?
Yes, because the thing about retail is that it is still a consistent, more traditional business. And because of how much time has been given to e-commerce, a lot of the brands that were previously digitally native, digital only, now realize that they actually need someone who knows how to run a store. That person may also need to develop their own knowledge around how to become more omni-channel, but the real skill set is first knowing how to run a physical location. And that is a pretty consistent part of what we're seeing in the space for sure.
That's helpful. I think you're very fortunate to have kind of that consistency
Yeah.
itself, because I think a lot of brands don't, a lot of startups don't have that with their brands. What would you say is has been the biggest barrier in your sales process for these types of customers?
The biggest barrier for us is that what we do as a product is a very specific function of a store. And it's really only once a store knows that they need something like us that we are a good fit, sort of right time, right place situation. So actually the big push for us is to move more toward inbound marketing as to support the top of our funnel for our sales cycle. As I said, our sales cycle is really short, but it's only short once a brand engages with us. So the big barrier for us is making sure that we know how to target not just the right customer, but the right customer at the right time. And we believe that marketing is actually the best way to uncover the right time part.
And what are the specific activities that you're talking about?
I think the big thing is content marketing for us, because a lot of the time, once you've reached, say, 4 to 6 locations where you have north of, say, 20 or 30 retail employees, you want to make sure that there's a consistent experience across all your locations. You want to make sure that there's a way to manage all of those different local events or activations or store services. You need something that actually scales across all of those stores. And so that means that there's going to be a new push to actually investigate and research and find those platforms. And Endear is really the best way to do that at that size, but we're not really that discoverable yet. So when you conduct that research, we want to make sure that we're at the top of the list everywhere you look for what platforms you should be using.
And so, have you invested in kind of paid marketing and press as well?
We've done a little bit of both. The only thing we really paid for on the marketing side, we really tried very early on here and there to do some very light social media ads. They did not work for us. I do not think that they will work for us for some time. I don't know for sure because that, quite frankly, is not my area of expertise. And I think that's why probably they didn't work for us. Press, on the other hand, did actually help us. We worked with an outside PR firm for sort of a short project-based window of time. And we actually did see a couple of brands come our way. And when we spoke to them, the conversation basically entailed them mentioning that first they had read about us through press, then they had looked us up and did some of their own research, and then it was basically on the third time that either a retail consultant mentioned us to them or another brand that used us mentioned us to them, or they got a referral about us that then they came to us directly, and that was sort of the inbound traffic we were getting.
That's interesting, kind of at least a three touch point funnel before they actually reached out to you or there was any interaction with you as a company.
It seemed that way. I will say the other big thing from inbound has been if it's a referral, mostly because they're usually requesting that referral or they're checking in on us with one of our customers, they come right away on that.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. I want to pivot a little bit to kind of structuring a sales organization and how you've really thought through how you structure sales. You mentioned it, you have about 40 some clients. In your evolution, when did you hire your first salesperson and how did you structure the sales team then versus how is it structured now?
We hired our first salesperson in the spring of 2019. At the time, we were not, that big, but we definitely had a few major customers that we were working with. We really knew what the product could do and couldn't do. And so when we brought a salesperson on, it was basically to do exactly what you're asking about, which is to bring more structure to our organization and make sure that we were creating a very consistent pipeline and strategy that we could quickly test and iterate and improve on a regular basis.
Once you had a salesperson on board, as a founder, how much were you still involved in the sales process, and how much are you still involved today?
So, like, I think when you hire anybody, you basically want to transfer responsibility slowly over time. But the person that we hired has worked out so incredibly well and really now understands exactly who to target, really understands exactly what kind of monthly yield we're expecting. And quite frankly, it's really exciting for me as a founder to get to look to the next thing and sort of see where, what's the next thing that we can tackle to really grow more quickly. And so by now, the only time that I'm really involved is when someone passes an intro to me because they know me personally or they know me as the founder. And I am really just there to set it up and move it over to our sales team at that point.
This is a real win. I don't know if you know how unique your situation is at this sort of stage of your company, but I don't hear this a lot from other founders. What I hear is we've hired salespeople, they haven't worked out, or it turned out that I, as the founder, the CEO, always had to be involved. We've gone through many sort of learning lessons. Your story is very different. You've really found kind of the right person and you've been able to get that person to take on so much of the selling work. Congratulations. That's amazing.
It's so funny because I've heard the same horror stories that you have, and I don't know. I don't know what happened, but honestly, like shout out to Casey Drake. He's amazing, very talented, really understands exactly who our customer is, and I would say that was the biggest turning point, and we as a team really drilled into understanding who we should be reaching out to, but you know, I have to say, like from May when he really joined us full time until now, we've had incredible months of growth, incredible improvements, even on the product side, and incredible traction with, levels of engagement and customer satisfaction. So real, big win for us for sure.
That's great. It's so nice to hear that because I think I hear way more horror stories than happy stories on this front. So that's just wonderful to hear and thanks to Casey Drake.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, lucky. I feel bad because on these podcasts, everyone's looking for advice, and I feel bad if like we happen to be the one time that things worked out.
No, but that gives people hope, right? It doesn't always
Good,
have to be
good. Yeah,
bad.
true.
Okay, so I want to shift to kind of our last question, which is, thinking through sort of B2B sales and the kinds of companies that you're selling to, and what's the one resource or piece of advice or program, anything that you would recommend to the founders in the listening audience that would help them kind of go through this process, make their first sale, learn about sales, and hopefully have the same kind of success that you've had?
Yes. So my big thing with general resources, so whether those are blogs or podcasts, is they're all really helpful for best practices and for learning about what tools to use and how to use them. But the reality is, a lot of that is much more about optimization, which doesn't really matter until you've got sort of your early customers with you. And so, my best advice on that front is you're going to learn much more from speaking to your actual customers than reading any of those blogs or listening to those podcasts. So, even if they're not actual paying customers yet, you asked me at the beginning, did you have ideal customers? If you can get those ideal customers into a room and spend time understanding why they said yes or why they said no, I think that's a much better use of your resources than continuing to read external, sort of non-relevant to your business documents or information. And the other big thing that was a huge sort of change for us is, one, uncovering those qualifiers that I mentioned earlier. So what separates a semi good fit from someone who thinks they're a good fit but really aren't, and those are definitely the ones to be most wary of, to who is it exactly that we can help the most and how do we get in front of them. I think that's really where to spend most of your time, in those early days.
So I think those are two great pieces of advice. But I will say to anyone listening to this podcast, you still should listen to this podcast.
Oh, yeah. Podcasts are great, of course. And I am specifically talking about those very early days, which is actually some of the hardest information to find, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I do agree with you that I think a lot of what's written on sales is more like after you have your first four customers, here's how you set up your sales pipeline spreadsheet. But getting to those first four is really like the key, right? So focusing on those early customers and that ideal customer, I think that's great advice. And I hope that everyone who's listening at that stage will absolutely take that advice and focus on the thing that's most important, which is kind of getting those first sales. So Leigh, thank you so much for sharing your stories and your experience on the podcast. I really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
So great to chat as always. I really enjoyed this.
Great. And thank you, our listening audience, for listening to the Retail X podcast. We'll have another episode out shortly. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to attend a Retail X Series event in person, check out www.retailxseries.com for upcoming events in New York. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Retail X Series. You can also learn more about me, find fundraising resources, or submit a pitch deck at www.redgiraffeadvisors.com. Thanks, and catch you next time.